Today, we're going to talk about one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. We're going to examine the systematic destruction of the Armenian people in the Ottoman Empire, looking at the historical record and the legal arguments that define these events as, really, the first modern genocide. Let that quote sink in for a moment. Adolf Hitler said this just before his invasion of Poland. This single, chilling question really sets the stakes for everything we're about to discuss. It points directly to the incredible danger of impunity, of what can happen when a crime of this magnitude is allowed to fade from memory. So before we can really get into the events, we have to understand the word itself. You see, the term genocide didn't even exist back in 1915. It was created decades later by a Polish-Jewish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, who was deeply affected by what he read about the Armenian massacres. The key part of the definition is the specific intent to destroy a group. That idea of intent, that's the legal heart of this entire story. To understand why this happened, we have to rewind the clock to the final decades of the Ottoman Empire. There was this term in diplomatic circles called the Armenian question. And what it really meant was, what do we do with the empire's Armenian Christian minority, who were simply asking for basic human rights and protection? And as you can see from this timeline, this was a tragedy that unfolded over decades. It wasn't a sudden event. In 1878, European powers promised to help, but they didn't follow through. Then came the Hamadryan massacres, a horrific, state-sponsored terror campaign. For a brief moment in 1908, it seemed like things might change with the Young Turk Revolution, but those hopes were just crushed a year later with the Adana massacres. All of this just proved how terribly vulnerable the Armenian people were. And here's the thing that's so hard to stomach. The world knew what was happening. As early as 1891, people were sounding the alarm. This was not a secret. The warning signs of a complete catastrophe were there for everyone to see, but the great powers of the day just failed to act. And that brings us to 1915. This is when persecution turned into something far more sinister, a centrally planned, systematic extermination. Under the cover of World War I, the Young Turk regime decided to execute its final plan. And let's be clear, this was not some chaotic side effect of war. It was a methodical, state-run operation. When you look at how it was carried out, the intent becomes terrifyingly clear. It was a cold, calculated, four-step process. First, you get rid of any possible resistance by disarming and killing Armenian men who were serving in the army. Second, on April 24, 1915, a date now remembered all over the world, you arrest and execute the community's leaders. Its doctors, its writers, its thinkers. You leave the people leaderless. Third, you force the rest, the women, the children, the elderly, on death marches into the desert. And finally, you seize everything they owned, which not only made the perpetrators rich, but also wiped the Armenian presence off the map. This kind of systematic process, it's a textbook sign of genocidal intent. And we don't even have to guess about their intentions. The architects of the genocide were actually proud of what they did. Just listen to these words from Talat Pasha, the man who masterminded the whole thing. He's not talking about relocation or some wartime necessity. He's boasting about solving the Armenian question, and he's proud of how efficiently he did it. And this wasn't some secret. Neutral observers on the ground, like the American ambassador, Henry Morgenthau, saw it for what it was. His reports to Washington were crystal clear. These deportations were a death sentence. This wasn't about moving people. It was about wiping them out. By the time it was over, around 1923, an estimated 1.5 million Armenians were gone. A people who had lived in that land for thousands of years were almost completely erased. Now, you'd think that after the war, there would be some kind of justice for the survivors. But what came next was, in many ways, a second betrayal, as politics and strategy once again pushed human rights to the side. And this slide just lays out that betrayal perfectly. On the one hand, you have the promise, the Treaty of Sevres in 1920, which called for an independent Armenia and trials for the men responsible. But just 3 years later, that promise vanished. The new Treaty of Lausanne, which created modern Turkey, had zero mention of Armenia or war crimes. The issue was just dropped, buried. So, with the world's courts failing them, a group of survivors decided they had to seek justice themselves. It was called Operation Nemesis. They hunted down the masterminds of the genocide who had escaped. The trial of Talat Pasha's assassin in Berlin was just incredible. The German court actually acquitted him after hearing all the evidence of the genocide. It was like the court itself was acknowledging that this was an act of justice. And all of this leads us to where we are today. locked in a century-long battle over history, over memory, and over the truth of what happened. So here's the core of the conflict today. On one side, you have an overwhelming consensus among historians and more than 30 countries that says, yes, this was absolutely a genocide. But on the other side, you have the official position of the Republic of Turkey, which strongly denies it. For them, it's not just about history. The state's narrative is that the deaths were a tragic part of war affecting everyone. To admit that its predecessors planned a genocide could challenge the very foundation of the modern republic. But despite that official denial, you can see the tide of history is moving in one clear direction. What started as a trickle of recognition has become a wave. Today, dozens of governments, including the US Congress, have formally recognized the historical fact of the Armenian Genocide. So, after more than a century, why does this all still matter so much? Why is it so important to confront this history and not just let it go? It really all boils down to this one fundamental question. Why does what we remember and how we remember it truly matter? What's at stake in this fight for the truth? And the answer, really, is that this is about so much more than just the past. Acknowledging the Armenian Genocide is, first and foremost, an act of justice for the 1.5 million souls who were lost, and for their descendants. But it's also a profound commitment to our future. It's about upholding the promise of never again, by making sure that the world never forgets. Because we know that ignoring these crimes only makes it more likely they will happen again.